Alright folks, this is going to be a long video. So today we're going to be addressing a lot of the arguments for and against the political compass. Now personally, I am for the political compass, and I'm going to defend the political compass as a tool to graph political positions. Alright, so without further ado, let's start off with the major arguments against the political compass. Alright, there are three major arguments that are held against the political compass, and each of these arguments will be addressed separately. So we have the first argument, which I call the argument of vaguity. Alright, this is basically saying that the spectrums of the political compass are too vague. They don't have set in stone definitions, and so it's very difficult to actually pinpoint your position. The second argument is the infinite axes argument. So this argument goes that theoretically, if you want to go closer and closer to the reality of politics, which this argument does play off the last one, but basically, if you actually want to reach a perfect representation of politics, you're going to have to plot yourself on an infinite number of axes. Alright? And then the third argument, and this is an argument that really gets a whole lot of people, especially on the right. The right really gets this argument hard. But the left, it has taken people away from the political compass on the left too. But it is the idea that there are certain corners that can never be achieved because the axes contradict each other at their most extreme points. Alright? So let's address each of these arguments one at a time. Alright, so starting with the vaguity argument. So let's take the traditional political compass and actually figure out just how vague the two axes that of the political compass are by using all of the colloquial definitions that are used by the average person for these things, for these different axes. So the first and most common colloquial definition of the x-axis is equality on the left and inequality on the right. The second most common is socialism on the left, capitalism on the right. The third is non-competition on the left and competition on the right. The fourth is progressivism on the left and traditionalism on the right. And the fifth is revolutionaryism on the left and reactionism on the right. Alright, so let's address each one of these things individually and where you're likely to find them. So, again, number one is the most common, but it is very simplistic and doesn't have much political nuance to it. There are some capitalist societies that would actually be considered far more leftist, despite being obviously more rightist in terms of policy, if you were to use the first definition. So, in terms of so a lot of people graduate from the first definition to the second definition. The problem with the second definition is that the second definition itself is very vague. Not many people will understand what socialism and capitalism is, and you can find definitions of socialism and capitalism, but the definitions of these two words are, well, they're not set in stone. And then we have people upgrading from there and saying that the left is non-competition and the right is competition. So they typically, this is typically where people end up, and this is where I have ended up. where you have on the left policies that discourage competition inside of the economy, and the right encourages competition within the economy. We then have number 4. We have definition number 4. This is typically used by people who are not used to the political compass. They are very, very new to the political compass and still see left and right in terms of the one-dimensional spectrum used by the mainstream society. So they will typically do things with progressive or traditionalism. And then you have people who are typically very confused and typically are caught in between this extremely primitive definition of progressivism on the left versus traditionalism on the right, and the very nuanced definition of non-competition versus competition. And they try to combine this to produce revolutionary and reactionary movements. The problem is that this excludes different positions. And so it is best in terms. So what do we need to define the x-axis as? What was the original intent of the x-axis? Well, the original intent of the x-axis was to plot down economic systems. It's an economic spectrum, and thus we need to find the best economic definition. And so the best economic definition of the x-axis is going to be the third definition, the non-competitive versus competitive. Now, unfortunately, this definition is not communicated very well, so not many people are going to understand it. But this definition is the most nuanced, and we can begin a transition to fix this vaguity issue in terms of the x-axis. So the vaguity issue does exist, but it is also fixable. Alright, so now let's look at the y-axis. How vague is the y-axis? Well, believe it or not, the y-axis actually has less definitions than the x-axis. And most of these definitions are actually stackable So we can use these definitions in terms of a ratio, believe it or not. So what are the 4 different definitions that can be ratioed with each other to create a very accurate view of authoritarianism versus libertarianism? Well, first off, let's look at how the laws function. So basically I have laissez-faire in the negative numbers and control on the positive numbers. So what do I mean by that? I don't mean laissez-faire economics, and I don't mean a control economy, because this has nothing to do with economics. This has everything to do with the government. So what does this mean? Well, laissez-faire can literally translates to leave us alone. So laissez-faire basically mean, so by laissez-faire I mean you have hands-off approach to law. And of course the extreme form of that would be to have basically no laws or no law enforcement. And the opposite of that would be a very heavy-handed legal system. To the point where, in the most extreme cases, you could have an attempt to create a hive mind situation, like in 1984, or in a more literal sense, actually incorporating a hive mind cybernetics into your population through force, which have all been theorized, but those are basically the logical extremes of these things. But again, we have the second definition, which is the actual structure of the government, what the government looks like. And that is controlled by the spread of power among individuals. So you have widely spread in the negative numbers and concentrated in the positive numbers. So think about it this way. In the most logical extreme of the negative numbers, you would have everybody sharing equal power throughout the society. So nobody has more power than another person in terms of politics. And that is anarchism. But on the extreme end of concentrated power, you have one person who has all of the government's responsibilities. All the powers of government is concentrated in one person. So basically, an absolute monarchy. And then we have the third definition. So the third definition goes towards militarism. Now, this is actually not very used commonly, and typically only is used to, just specify regimes similar to no Germany. And so basically what it is on the extreme end of one side, you have the military focus. You might not even have a military at all. You just focus extremely on pacifism. And on the extreme end, on the other side, you have military aggression, meaning you are very trigger happy when it comes to war. We also have the fourth definition, which is how accessible positions of power are, because you can have highly concentrated power that is very easily accessible, and that is more libertarian than the same concentrated power that is not easily accessible by the people. So on one end, you have a government that's completely elected. The people have all the power, all that stuff. And on the other end, you have a government that's completely appointed. Now, you could put more nuance into things. You could put different styles of secede into your position, like inheritance, executive power, direct vote in terms of the extreme libertarianism, stuff like that. And maybe you could even go more specific than that. But basically, in the most simple terms, it's accessibility on one end and inaccessibility on the other. So what do I mean by this is actually a very easy thing to deal with? We can actually have all four definitions. Well, that's because we can ratio these definitions with each other. Unlike the x-axis, where some definitions are mutually exclusive to other definitions, on the y-axis, each of these definitions can exist parallel to each other and can be used as a ratio. For example, if, let's say, you have a very militarily aggressive society that is very inaccessible and has very concentrated power, but is laissez-faire, that's going to be more libertarian than something that has than the same thing with a controlling legal system. And you basically ratio it. And that also allows for centrism. So, for example, if you have a very controlling legal system with very concentrated power, but it's militarily pacifist and the positions of power are very accessible, that kind of neutralizes itself and places it right into the center. And so you can have this centrism, and this centrism is actually very, very easy to accomplish. So the y-axis actually does not have much of a problem in terms of the y-axis is not very much of a problem in terms of vaguity. It's not very vague at all. You can easily just ratio the different definitions, and it will work as an accurate representation of how authoritarian or libertarian the society is. The only real problem is the x-axis, and the x-axis I've already demonstrated can be easily fixed. Alright, now let's move on to the second argument. So the second argument has to do with the possibility of infinite spectrums. Now, there are many people who will argue that in order to actually have an accurate view of politics, we have to have infinite spectrums. But I would argue differently. I would argue it's not even possible to have infinite political spectrums. And here's why. Because Politics can only affect three things in a society. Politics can only affect government, the economy, and culture. Think about it. No matter the regime, no matter if the regime is an absolute monarchy or anarchism, no matter if the regime is communist or capitalist, no matter if the regime is a theocracy or a liberal, progressive, ultra-progressive society, the only things that these societies can really control are situations of government, which is already represented by the y-axis, economy, which is represented by the x-axis, and culture, which unfortunately is not represented, but could easily be made represented if we were, and a lot of people already are attempting to represent it in terms of things like the Shapley Values Test, as well as PolitiCube, with my personal favorite being PolitiCube as the most accurate representation. Now, we already have established that government and economy are like this, but culture we haven't established its validity. I would personally postulate, given that culture is the theoretical spectrum that is missing from the political compass, that we need to make culture based off of social group exclusion on one end versus social group inclusion on the other. But that is my personal opinion. That is a topic for another video. However, there is no fourth element that governments can really affect. True, you could theoretically add in that they can affect technology and ecology, but you could also argue that that is just a natural byproduct of human interaction, the effect of on the ecology and technology, and that regardless of your governmental system, they will be affected by it. So it's basically a byproduct of the system you're already in, and so you can't control it independently. So now let's move on from there to addressing the chopped corners argument. Now, there's a reason why I called it the chopped corners. And personally, this is the area where I feel strongest in. Even if you were to prove the compass is not a good fit for political representation, this argument still stands, and it's my strongest argument. You got to, if you're going to use the political compass, you got to use all of the political compass. Alright? And here's why. Most people on Earth fit into 4 familial systems. And these 4 familial systems actually align pretty decently with the 4 corners of the political compass. Now, there are other familial systems that are different, but they are typically more rare and are also slightly related to these 4 in different ways. So let's address these. So we have endogamous clan structures. So what an endogamous clan structure is and why it's different from most other familial structures is that it is a familial structure in which the elders of the family have absolute control over the youth. To the point where in most endogamous clan societies, you have, in most clan societies really, because that's defined by clan. So in most clan societies, all marriages are arranged marriages. So it is very controlling. Elders have absolute power over the youth. But in endogamous clans specifically, endogamous connotates that the family members within this family are treated unequally. They are not treated as equals with each other. Okay? So there's of course the inequality of the elder family members having absolute control over the youngers, but there's also the layer where even amongst the elders and the youngers, they are not treated equally amongst each other. So it's not just a difference between elder and younger, it's a difference parallel as well. Compared with the exogamous clan, where even though there is an inequality in terms of elders are more powerful than youngers, if you are an elder, all the elders are treated equally, and if you are a younger, all the youngers are treated equally. Alright? Now, of course, there are going to be slight variations of these. Some endogamous clan structures are going to be slightly more equal in some ways than others, and exogamous clan structures are going to be slightly more unequal in ways than others, and vice versa. And some clan structures are not quite as authoritarian as others, but it's still the basic idea of competition within the family and control within the family versus equality within the family and control within the family. But so far, we've only talked about clan structures, which has a very controlling family structure. Now let's move on to the nuclear family. And there are two variations of the nuclear family as well. So first off, we have the absolute nuclear. Alright? So the absolute nuclear family is very similar to the endogamous clan structure. So basically, it is nuclear families are families that are very freeing. There are some controlling nuclear families, but as a general rule of thumb, typically there is more of a hands-off approach to family rearing. And typically, there are no arranged marriages, and arranged marriages, in some instances of nuclear families, are actually seen as forms of abuse. And so, by these societies. And so, but the absolute nuclear is where within that very free, you can do whatever you want family structure, you have an inequality within the family. And within that, contrast that with the equal nuclear, whereas within the free family, you have everyone treated equally, and you basically have a two-spectrum situation with clan societies on the top, where the elders control all the youngers, nuclears on the bottom, where the elders don't have absolute power anymore, and exogamous and equals, which may mean that everyone within their area is equal to each other, and the absolute and endogamouses, which is where no one is equal. And so, what does this do? Well, this creates two factions that make two totally different arguments that are both chopped corners. Alright, so we have people that were raised in either exogamous clans or absolute nuclears. And these people say that extreme alt-right societies and extreme lib-left societies cannot exist. Now, the reason they say this is because they either were raised in an absolute nuclear or an exogamous clan structure. And so, they can only perceive politics within their own society or their opposite. So let me give you an example. In the US, the U.S. is mostly absolute nuclear. So that means that most people who believe that let's say they liked the way they were raised, and let's say they were not being rebellious, and they actually wanted to pursue how they were raised and their traditions. So they would perceive political right wing, aka competition within the economy, with freedom, and they would view that as inherently tied because that was how they and everyone around them was raised. And they would view the opposite, aka the rebellious people, as people who have equality. So the people who are equal, that they advocate for equality. And in that same vein, since they are advocating for equality, that must mean that they are advocating for absolute control as well. But the thing is, that doesn't only apply to these two familial systems. It also applies to endogamous clan and equal nuclear structures. Because in people, let's say, for example, you lived in an equal nuclear society. Okay? You would most likely, if you liked your family and you were not rebellious, you would most likely pursue freedom and equality in politics. And you would see that as a possibility, but you wouldn't see inequality and competition and equality and authoritarianism as possible because you would see, because you inherently tie freedom and equality together within your mind. And the same thing with your opposite, those who you would view as rebellious, as someone raised in equal nuclear, would go for control and competition. And you would view competition as necessitating some form of control. And so, what conclusion can we make? Well, the conclusion that we can make is, are there any societies that have been formed in any amount of time, just as long as it's long enough to have people actually understand that they're living in this society and actually, do things within the society, that were written all four extreme corners? Does that exist? Yes, it does. So, first off, let's look at the extreme alt-right corner. Alright, the extreme alt-right corner. There have been multiple feudalistic societies that were built off of extreme economic competition and were extremely totalitarian in every way. This has happened, and they have lasted for literally thousands of years in some cases. But what about their libertarian counterparts? What about the extreme lib right? Well, there have also been anarchist societies that were very capitalistic, very laissez-faire capitalistic. An example would be the micronation formed by the pirates in the Caribbean during the whole British colonial era and the whole American Revolution situation. There, they were actually able to create a completely free society that had a very competitive economy. But what about the opposite of that? What about authoritarian left? Well, within the authoritarian left, it is a little harder to find these civilizations, but they do exist. An example would be the social monarchy that formed in a province of Mongolia during the Tsardom. Now, unfortunately, this province was invaded, but it was an absolute monarchy that had a socialist economic system, meaning it was not built off of economic competition, but was rather built off of non-competition and being very uncompetitive. And so you have this situation where you have an absolutely authoritarian society with a very left-wing economy. But what about lib-left? Well, there have actually been multiple lib-left societies. Now, typically they don't last too long, but a few have lasted a couple of decades. And an example would be Easy Alien in the Mexican jungle. They have lasted for approximately 30 years. But a more substantial example that actually had a much larger population and was actually able to produce good numbers was revolutionary Catalonia, which was a province in Spain. And they were able to create an anarchist and syndicalist society with absolute freedom and absolute equality. Alright, I hope you liked this video, and I hope you learned something. If you want to support the channel, like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. See y'all!